Chris has some things I think we would be interested in. And just an aside, he's really a foodie. And also he likes kimchi, and he likes jogging. He likes medieval music. He likes liberation music of Southern Africa. And he sees life as a jigsaw, and his research as a jigsaw puzzle. And how do we find meaning and patterns? So, and the deeper why of things. So Chris, I'll turn this over to you and just get out of the way. And please, everybody, use your chat. Feel free to chat, put in your ideas. So we will take a couple of pauses and bring in your ideas and your questions so we can have more of a conversation and less a presentation. Okay, Chris, we're in your hands.
Thank you, Tom, Barry, and Jerry, for your kind comments. Just to briefly pick up on what you were all saying, part of the origin of this was back in the 90s when Tom and Jerry, excuse the name, so Jerry and Tom, perhaps I should say, both referred to that. And at that time, both Jerry and I had been working in the Horn of Africa before, Jerry in Ethiopia and I was in Sudan, and there was a huge famine. Many tens, hundreds of thousands of people died. And then we were confronted by this drought in Southern Africa. We thought the same thing would happen again. So we were in a way prisoners of our experience, which is one of the things I've learned that happens to us, but there wasn't a famine. And so I then started to look at why that was, and that involved participatory research in 3 countries. I carried that out in the mid-90s, didn't quite finish it, went off to Asia with Save the Children, and then came back in 2004 to finish it off with a grant from Ford that Jerry had kindly intermediated. And I was then following up on why famine hadn't resulted from drought. That's another story, but that's an interesting one. Then I finished that follow-up study, came back to the UK just before Christmas 2004, and then Boxing Day 2004, as most of you might recall, there was a huge tsunami. And that resulted in what was then the biggest and fastest response by individuals and organizations to an emergency probably in humanitarian history. And I started to wonder, well, why were there such rapid and huge responses to that? And why were there so many forgotten emergencies which people were not responding to? So that set me off on the path of looking at what influences people and organizations to respond in certain ways to certain things and not to respond to certain others. And as I began to research this, a number of other crises cropped up in the 2000s. There was the Hurricane Katrina in the States, and then the 2008 financial crisis, and actually hidden behind that were 2 other crises which perhaps weren't recognized by everybody. For the first time in history, the number of overweight people, I think, exceeded the number of underweight people around that time. And also, for the first time, around that period, China overtook the US as the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So there were 3 kind of concurrent crises that were emerging around 2008, 2010. And of course, since then, in the last decade, there have been other crises, in particular the political crises of 2016 in the US and the UK, and there have been others elsewhere. So I was then looking at what are the common factors underlying these things, and a pattern started to emerge. And that pattern emerged when I reframed these crises as behavioral crises, that essentially they were all the aggregated and accumulated outcomes of the consequences of the behaviors of myriad individuals and organizations and many governments over a period of time. And I think you can see that with the coronavirus crisis, that's the output, the result of many individual behaviors, and also the solutions until vaccines are found are changes in behaviors as well. So that's an example of a behavioral crisis, both in terms of its causes and in terms of some of the solutions. Now, behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. They happen as a result of influences, and influences is a bit of a gloopy term. So I think to unpack it, you can disaggregate it into 3 elements. Influence methods, marketing methods and political messages and so on. Interactions, the way that people transmit those messages, and thirdly, information, which is used to target those methods. And very often you find that there's imbalances in the way those three elements of influence are used, so that in any situation where there is an inequality, there are imbalances of influence. And this is a quote from Martin Luther King, which expresses one particular influence that I think is important, the immediacy of the present. And these crises that we're now confronted with have to be addressed in the next few years if they're to be effectively addressed at all. But there are many factors which put us off effective action. And I'll come on to some of those. And these are three quotes that I found useful. I've added those words in red. Those who don't learn from the past condemn others to repeat it. And then Sun Tzu, the Chinese military strategist who lived about 500 BC, who wrote, and his words are often quoted, if you know your enemies and you know yourself, and I then added those words in red, if you know their target groups, because I think the so-called enemies of progressive, of those involved in sustainable development, there are many target groups they have. If you know both them and ourselves, then we won't be put at risk. But if you know neither yourself nor your enemies nor their target groups, then we've got problems. And these crises that I've been trying to pull together are what I've summarized in this table as Apocalypse 9, to borrow that the title of the movie. 9 clusters. You can cluster them and sort them out in different ways, but I put them in those 9 categories. And within each of those categories, there's many sub-crises, which I won't go into now. But underlying all of them, I think there are crises of inequality. So underlying every crisis, some organizations, particularly certain special interest groups, whether they're political or commercial, have disproportionate imbalanced influence. They use influence methods in imbalanced ways. They use information in imbalanced ways to target those methods, and they exploit their interactions with people in power in imbalanced ways. And those three imbalances underlie many of those crises. And so the question that three questions I'm going to try and address in this session are: what differentiates these current crises of the 21st century from previous crises? Why do we not respond to them effectively, and how can we improve our responses? So the old traditional crises are summarized by the 4 horse persons, perhaps, of the apocalypse. Actually, there's 3. There's death, famine, pestilence, and war. And I suppose death is common to all of them. So essentially, there are 3 there. Those still exist, but they've been added to by those other 6 or so clusters that I outlined in that table. What makes them different is that they are behavioral crises primarily. Those old crises, I think, were largely acts of God, pestilence and war, or acts of a very small number of people, leaders and kings and queens and generals. But nowadays, these crises that we're confronted with are the aggregated and accumulated outcomes of all of our behaviors and the organizational behaviors. They result from those 3 sets of the imbalances in interactions, influence methods on the left, and information. But in the last 20 years, these imbalances have been massively amplified by what I refer to as 3 influence amplifiers: the social media, the internet, and smartphones. I think you can see those amplifications at work in the COVID crisis with fake news and conspiracy theories. They were very much at work in the 2016 crises, in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, in the UK, and the fake news and conspiracy theories and so on, and the way Trump handled the social media very much better, as some of you were saying earlier, than progressives. And I think one of the lessons I've learned from this is that this is now the age of influence. We're in a new environment of influence. Sorry, that's the heading of that one. We're in a new environment of influence. And in this new environment, those who can out-influence others are more likely to succeed. So in previous eras, scientific facts and evidence and solid news counted, but now it's really who can influence whom most effectively. And that's what I refer to as this new environment of influence. And these special interest groups, which I think underlie all of these crises, exploit two sets of influencing revolutions in imbalanced ways. One set of revolutions are in the behavioral sciences and the related sciences, such as nudge you may have heard of. That's just one of them, but there's other aspects of the behavioral sciences working on the emotions, social influences, cognition, neuroscience, and so on. And then the related sciences concern organizational behavior and network science. And then the second set of influencing revolutions are those which involve the technologies of expanding and amplifying influence, those three influence amplifiers, which are new largely in the 21st century: the social media, smartphones, and the internet. And special interest groups in general have been very effective in exploiting both of these two influencing revolutions. And I think in general, they've been much more effective in exploiting them than progressives and others working in sustainable development. There are exceptions, but that's a sort of broad generalization. And one particular way of summarizing this is that top diagram summarizes those three imbalances of interactions, of methods and information, which these special interest groups, if you look behind any crisis, I think the climate change crisis, there's fossil fuel companies and vehicle companies, the opioids crisis, there's pharmaceutical companies, the lifestyle disease crises, there's food and beverages organizations, and tobacco and alcohol corporations, and so on. So behind all of them, I think almost all of them, these special interest groups cause crises. But then secondly, the bottom left, they weaken interventions that are developed to address them. And thirdly, they sometimes degrade institutions that comprise society's immune system. And as an example of that, after the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, that was in part caused by the policies of the last year, the Clinton administration, which were influenced by Wall Street. Robert Rubin, Clinton's Treasury Secretary, if I remember correctly, he was a Wall Street banker, and he and others lobbied for the abolition, the scrapping of the Glass-Steagall Act. And that scrapping led to the financial crisis, many would say. And then secondly, in the aftermath of that, when Obama was trying to clear it up, there were the same financial people were involved in watering down, weakening interventions that were used to try and address this financial crisis. I think the Dodd-Frank Act, if I remember correctly, was weakened as a result of their lobbying and their imbalanced interactions with policymakers. The third set is, I think, in some ways most pernicious, and I would use the three Ps. These special interest groups have had influences which are pernicious, potent, and pervasive. And they've been degrading institutions for about the last 40 years. And one of the best examples of that, I think, is the Koch brothers in the States, who've been degrading institutions. And that came to a head in the Trump era when he and his cabinet were degrading, for example, the EPA. I think somebody calculated that maybe 150 or 200 previous regulations were abolished by Trump. And then the postal system in the US was degraded by Trump appointments. And behind many institutions, there have been these special interest groups degrading them, particularly in the States and also in the UK. I think that's perhaps happening now with the introduction or the attempt to introduce identity cards for voting and so on. And I think you can see that from 2010 and before that. Certain institutions here have been degraded. And also in Hungary, Poland, I think Brazil, in any democracy which is under threat, you can see institutions being degraded by special interest groups. And just as AIDS opens up the body to attack by opportunistic infections, so I think the degrading of society's immune systems opens up societies and economies to attack by opportunistic crises. And I think the COVID crisis is a good example of that. Because of the reduction in society's immune systems, its institutions, it's been left vulnerable in many countries, and here and in the US, to the COVID crisis. And that's one of the reasons the degradation of institutions, why the US and the UK and some other democracies have performed badly. And the hedonic treadmill here refers to the way in which companies exploit our desire to improve ourselves, but it's a treadmill in that when we improve our thing, get bigger cars, so everybody else does, and we just stay still, basically. So we don't move forward because everybody else does the same thing. Businesses are exploiting a principle of influence called social comparison. We compare ourselves and our situations with those of others. And that's why we buy stuff, and that's often as a result of peer pressure. And the example of SUVs in Europe is a good example. I think in the last 12 or 15 years, sales of SUVs have increased almost fivefold, and that has almost completely offset the gains in efficiency and in energy efficiency and the reductions in greenhouse gases brought about by electrification. And here's another example of special interest groups lobbying and interacting. There was a study carried out by an outfit called Influence Map, and they looked at those five corporations there and what they'd done since 2015. They'd spent over $1 billion on lobbying against the Paris Climate Agreement, although overtly in their PR greenwash, they were claiming they were doing all sorts of good things. But in fact, drilling down into their figures, only 3% of their expenditure was on sustainable energy, and they were planning in 2019 to spend over $100 billion on new fossil fuel exploration. And in fact, I think the UK government, which is hosting the Paris, the COP summit in Glasgow, is still open to opening new licenses for fossil fuel exploration in the North Sea, which is a bizarre contradiction, it seems to me. And the second question is, why are responses to these crises too little, too late, and inequitable? And I think the answers to those questions relate in part to a view of human nature, which I think needs to be reviewed. As Einstein said, many people may be familiar with that quote, you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. We've been these problems, many of them, I think, have been created by a mindset over the past 40 years, which promotes market fundamentalism above many other things. Ubuntu is it's old and it's new. So a lot of the research, in fact, mirrors what has been known for centuries, if not millennia, in traditional societies in Africa, Asia, and I imagine in South and Central America as well. And Walt Whitman's comment also reflects something of what I'm going to try and say in the next few slides. So what is the same and what's different about these crises? And one of them is the context. I think what is the same about our reactions to them is that we've still got the same cognitive and emotional apparatus that we had centuries ago. But what is different is the contexts in which we operate and in which these influences operate too. As Churchill said, I don't agree with many things Churchill did or said, but he was right on with one or two things. We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And I think that applies to the contexts in which we operate. We've built up the social media, the internet, smartphones, we built them, but now they're having profound impacts on us, as are all of the other institutions in which we live and work every day. So one of the comments that's been made that I think reflects this interesting idea that helps explain why we haven't responded very well to current crises. E.O. Wilson, who's a sociobiologist, still living, I think, he said that we've got Stone Age brains with medieval beliefs and godlike technology. And Tristan Harris is an ethicist now at Google. He was, I think, employed by Google, but he's now seen the error of his previous ways, apparently, and he's now come out with trying to show how social media corporations and others are changing the way we think and act and feel. So he's added on that modification. We've got medieval institutions. So the institutions that we have to deal with these crises are outdated. And I think one example of that is what happened after 2016 when Zuckerberg was questioned by Congress. The Congress people there were asking him questions which showed that they really didn't know much about social media, and the regulations, as many people are now aware, to regulate the laws and regulations to regulate the social media are way out of sync with what is needed. And so that summarizes that comment on the right. And the cognitive influences, which I think are out of step, help explain why we don't respond in the same as we should to these current crises. And these are cognitive influences which are inherited from our lives as hunter-gatherers. And I think for most of the existence of Homo sapiens been as hunter-gatherers. And in those earlier existences, the threats and risks that hunter-gatherers faced were immediate. They were nearby, immediate, close, and similar and familiar to them. Wild animals and so on, floods, everything which was close and nearby. Now, over the past 200 years, one way of framing development is in terms of risk shifts. Development has progressively shifted risks away from ourselves and those in rich countries to those in poor countries. So the climate crises are a good example of that. Most of the impacts of those are felt in lower income countries and by poor people in those countries. Those risk shifts mean that the risks of climate change and other things are what I would call 4D. The impacts are distant, delayed, diffused, such as air pollution, and they happen to different people in different places. And our brains are not really configured to respond to those 4D kinds of threats. Another thing that we're not really configured to respond to is big numbers and huge things, because our ancestors dealt with small things in their everyday lives, and big numbers numb their brains, and one of the foremost, or numb their ways of thinking and responding. One of the foremost experts in the area of risk perception and response is Paul Slovich, and he's coined this term called psychic numbing. We are numbed by big numbers, and as an example of that, he gave what happened to Aylan Kurdi, the Kurdish refugee boy who was washed up on the shores of, I think, was it Turkey, some years ago. And up until then, there hadn't been much attention on the Syrian crisis. But then suddenly, when that one photo appeared, there was a big spike. In fact, he carried out research in Malawi, Paul Slovich, on different ways of presenting information in 2004 with Save the Children. And he showed that if information was transmitted, please donate $10 because there'll be a famine in a few months' time and 1 million people will die. He compared that with a flyer message. Here, a little girl called, I forget her name for the moment, but she was a Malawian girl, a real life girl. She's going to she may starve to death in a few months if she doesn't get adequate food. And unsurprisingly, that singular message got a lot more response than the big numbered message. So there are various cognitive influences that slow us down, and social influences as well. We look around us to see what happens, how other people are responding, and I think that's true in the COVID crisis. And most people don't respond in rapid and dramatic ways to climate crises, and so we take our cues from them. Motivational influences are important. I'll come on to those in a minute, and the emotions. And the contrast between COVID and climate crises are important. COVID, the emotional influences are fairly dramatic. They evoke fear, as does terrorism, fear and dread and shock, and climate crises don't. So we respond to things which evoke dread and fear, as does, initially at least, the COVID crisis, but we don't respond to things like climate change and lifestyle diseases in the same way. And a further cluster is the motivational influences, and those include things like loss aversion, and that's the finding that we respond twice as much to losses as we do to gains. And I think that helps explain why these special interest groups fight so hard against regulations, fossil fuel corporations, drug corporations, finance corporations, they fight very hard to preserve their current position because they're worried about the losses they might experience if these new regulations, taxes and laws came into effect. Whereas for most people, the gains of those are fairly diffuse and they're not so concentrated. And that does help, I think, explain why, to some extent, special interest groups fight so much harder than most people. Finally, 4 clusters of human biases that help explain why we don't respond. Competition neglect, and that refers back to that quote from Sun Tzu. You need to take account of what your enemies are doing just as much as what you want to do. And I think many people in sustainable development, on progressives in politics, haven't taken sufficient account of how special interest groups, whether they're fossil fuel companies or right-wing politicians, how they are influencing people, and in particular how they're evoking negative emotions. This is true particularly, I think, of the far right. They focus on fear, loss aversion again among white communities who feel that they've lost out in globalization over the past few decades. And so I think generally progressives and those campaigning against climate, to address climate crises and other crises in those clusters, they haven't taken sufficient account of the potent, pervasive and pernicious ways in which special interest groups influence all of us in our everyday lives and influence governments and other organizations and the media too. Second one is confirmation bias, which I think you're probably familiar with. People look to find facts which confirm their beliefs, and I think that's very true in the current pandemic. People look for facts and false news and fake news and conspiracy theories to confirm what they want to do or what they don't want to do. And thirdly, overconfidence is one of the biggest problems. Daniel Kahneman, the leading psychologist, was asked once, what bias of human nature do you think you're most worried about? And he said, overconfidence. And I think if you look back at the crises in the last 20 years, policymakers who've blundered into wars and financial disasters and so on have been overconfident in their abilities, in their knowledge of the situation. And there's also something which he referred to as theory-induced blindness, that people are blinded by the theories that they have. So the conservatives have this theory about market fundamentalism, and that blinds them to the dangers that market fundamentalism brings about. And the final thing is consistency, which is a quote from, I think, Thoreau, is it somebody, I forget who said, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And most people want consistency in their own lives and in the lives of others, but when it's taken to extremes, then it becomes foolish, such as the austerity policies of the previous, well, current government, actually, since 2010. There may have been some minimal justification. I don't think there was, but some people think there was, but it was taken to extremes. They were consistent with it, refused to change, and so it became foolish. And I think that applies to many policies of the right, but also sometimes of progressives as well. They stick with the same mindsets and policies, and they don't shift. They don't look at the competition and don't see what others are doing. The triple tensions is one way I've taken to summarizing the why we haven't responded in the right way to crises, and also why they've arisen in the past 20 or so years in particular. And these triple tensions are those between our self-interest and other interest, between the short term and the long term, and between individualism and collectivism. I think here there's an example there of confirmation bias. Adam Smith not only wrote that people follow their own interests and the invisible hand leads to markets solve things, but he also said that people are interested in the fortunes of others, and that gives them happiness. That is neglected by most on the right, and that illustrates the other side of that first tension between self-interest and other interest. And I think over the past 40 years, a story in particular put out by Reagan, what I call the Reagan meta story, in his first inaugural address. He said, government in our present crisis, he did say, refer to that, what he was facing then, but that's been taken up by many on the right. In this crisis, government is the problem. And so that's led to tax cuts, deregulation, privatization, outsourcing, and so on. And that meta story, I think, has linked up with social norms that have been shifted over the last 40 years towards self-interest and the short term. And it's also linked up with changes in the way people see themselves. Social identity has come up, identity politics has come up as an issue. And that, I think, those three things have reinforced each other. And George Soros, the financier, refers to these as reflexivity, that if you say government is a problem, then if you say it often enough and repeat it often enough, people come to believe it, and they apply that in their everyday lives. You can see that, I think, playing out with the big lie in the States. Many people believe that big lie about the election having been stolen last year because it's been repeated often enough by Trump and his supporters. So those triple tensions are one way of looking at what's happened over the last 40 years. They've shifted to the short term, the individualistic, and the self-interest. And I think what progressives need to do now is to try and rebalance those triple tensions, and do so by rebalancing all the influences in people's everyday lives. So that really is part of the answer to what's next, the last part of the three questions. What's next? How do we do, and what do we need to do? It's rebalancing these influences, because if we don't do that, we're going to come to tipping points which are approaching fairly fast. One of them is the 2030 deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals. Another, more immediately, is happening in the US, when in 18 months' time there'll be the midterm elections, which could well go the way of the Republicans, and that could lead to the Republicans then refusing to certify any Democratic win in 2024. So some of these tipping points are quite nearby, and I think this is why this decade is a critical decade. So we need to try and change these tipping points to turning points so that we can shift the direction. And this doesn't just mean going in the opposite way from Reagan to say, he said government was bad, now we should say government is good. I think it's more complicated than that. We need to look at the whole plethora and complexity of influences in communities and individuals and organizations. How can we leverage and link those influences to bring about the changes that are needed to address these crises? And among other things, I think it does need a new narrative, a new story that needs to emerge, and people are talking about this with the increased role of government. But again, I think it's more complicated than just saying government is good now, whereas before it was bad. People need to take into account the complexities of government and human nature. One of the narratives that Paul Collier, an economist at Oxford who's focused on Africa, has talked about is communitarianism, which is a bit of a long word. Not everybody agrees with that, but it's focusing on communities and how communities need to be revived, and they've got hidden resources. And that is, I think, been seen during the pandemic, when communities have come up with pro-social behaviors to help others in need. And this leads to more or less the two final points. It takes two to influence, and I think to do all these things, to change these balances and these tipping points, we need to be aware of these influences and undertake some kind of influence analysis. Be aware that people and organizations are influencing us and others. How can we influence them and ourselves? Firstly, to defend against their pernicious influences. Secondly, to use these influences, the whole wide range of them, to change the behaviors of individuals and organizations. And thirdly, to bring about systems transformation, which is a term in vogue at the moment. But I think systems transformation can be helped to be brought about if people take into account these influences and apply them at critical points in systems, leverage points, which I think Donella Meadows referred to when she was talking about systems some years ago. And I think what isn't done and what doesn't happen is often as important as what is done and what does happen. And I refer to these three uns. Part of the problem is that many of these influences that we could use are unlinked. So therefore, we're unaware of them and they remain unused. And one of the tasks, I think, of all of us is to try and link up these influences to increase awareness of them, how we're being influenced in ways that lead to these crises, and how we can use these influences in ways that promote solutions to those crises. And so as a triple uns, if they're reversed, I think we can then leverage and link three sets of hidden resources which help us to realize social potential. And those three hidden resources are the principles of influence, which I referred to earlier under some headings: cognition, emotions, social principles of influence, and motivation, and so on. Secondly, the context in which those operate. Those contexts are also hidden resources for many people. They've been exploited much more effectively by the right and by special interest groups than generally than progressives have exploited them. And the third set of hidden resources are those under the heading of pro-social behaviors, which relate to helping, volunteering, sharing, giving, and cooperating. And those are the five types of pro-social behaviors which behavioral scientists have been researching for many years. And I think that research has been rather neglected by or overlooked by those in development. And this finally, I think, if we can bring all those things together, we can realize social potential, which I would define as the potential that people have if they're linked and if they're influenced in appropriate ways to generate solutions that they couldn't find if they acted individually. And if we can rebalance all of these influences in appropriate ways, then this can lead to what I term a modification of that triple bottom line, the quintuple bottom line, individual well-being. I think pro-social behaviors, it's been found, promote individual well-being. People feel better by giving away things and by helping others. It improves their own well-being. Productivity and creativity at work. It's been found, contrary to Friedman's point that businesses just have to be concerned with profits. A behavioral scientist called Adam Grant did a lot of research with organizations and found actually that people within businesses who helped others were the most productive, and they helped their businesses to thrive. And thirdly, if those businesses encouraged volunteering by their staff in communities, then it helped with community cohesion. It also improved the reputation and trust that local communities and others had in those businesses. So that in turn leads to broader societal well-being and finally to improvements in the environment and climate. So that's the quintuple bottom line, and I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Absolutely brilliant. So let's open it up to questions or comments on what we've heard and what this means. Give you time to reflect, but either put it in the chat or unmute yourself and what does this mean? How do we make meaning of all this? And it's a battle of who can influence whom more effectively, like Chris said, and what changes do we need to make?
I'll ask a question. It's Barry here, Tom. I mean, what does this mean for us on a day-to-day basis? Do we need to get rid of our egos, to reform our institutions so that we collaborate more, to think wider across the kind of silos that we self-impose, and stop being righteous in that our view of the world is right and everyone else is wrong? I mean, what do we do on a practical day-to-day basis for those who have been, those of us have been working in civil society, philanthropy, and related fields? Can we actually do this? And what would be do we need to fall even further before we take action, or are there some immediate kind of triggers we can, begin to enact what you're saying, Chris? Because I think, you've given us the background, but the question is now, how the hell do we use this stuff when you know, the forces against us seem so well organized, and we seem so shambolic by comparison.
And then let me add in Jeff Kendall's comment in the chat box is that's a lot. So what do you recommend is the best resource for people who want to dig in more? So there's similar questions there. And we'll let Chris have a shot at these questions. And then I'd ask the rest of us and the participants to come up with kind of our own recommendations about how do we move the needle? What do we do? And what are the best resources? So Chris, we'll give you a shot, and then I'll turn to the rest of us, and hopefully we'll have some other suggestions.
Thank you for those questions. I should say I've been trying to link a lot of stuff together. So as you pointed out, Gary, or Jeff, is it Gary? There's a lot there, and my apologies for the rush through it. It's 15 years of secondary research compressed into 20 or 30 minutes. So apologies for the gallop. I can send references later, but what I've been trying to do really is there's a trade-off between, I think, breadth and depth, and I've been going for breadth, trying to link different disparate things together. But for more specific answers, and I can send references and readings later to you all on any particular issue, or try to. There's a lot out there which I'm happy to forward later. But a couple of things initially. One of them is to go to that one of the last points in those slides, influence analysis. What are the influences around us that are influencing us to do what we do, and that are, on the other hand, influencing us not to do things that we should do? Because both sides of those questions, I think, are important. Many of those questions, those answers, are social influences, but they're also motivational. What do we stand to lose if we change our behaviors? Look around us at all of the adverts and the messaging of commercial companies. I mean, there was a statistic, I think, produced some years ago by one at World Watch Institute, I think, which looked at the messages put out in the States. And for every message that was trying to promote sustainable behaviors, there were 1,000, or for every dollar spent, there were 1,000 spent on promoting unsustainable behaviors. So the ratio is massively tilted, imbalanced in favor or disfavor of those promoting unsustainable behaviors. And in the UK, there was a statistic that found that for every pound spent on promoting alcohol consumption, for every pound spent on promoting, say, sensible drinking, the drinks companies were spending £70 on getting people to drink more. So I think one answer is looking around us at the political messages, the commercial messages. How are they influencing us and others around us in terms of cognitions, how we perceive things, in terms of our social influences, in terms of our emotions and motivations, and so on. And a second answer might be to take the perspective. Perspective taking is something which behavioral scientists have come up with, but so have many others. Put yourself in the shoes of both those who are doing the influencing and those who are being influenced. How are they being influenced? How do they see things? Their perspective on the world is rather different from that of many progressives. And I think that's perhaps been part of the reason why progressives in the UK and the States haven't done very well, with the exception possibly of Biden recently, over the past few decades, because they haven't sufficiently taken the perspective of certain population segments into account.
Yeah, thanks. Borislav, would you mind unmuting and share your question with us?
Yes, hello. Thank you for this fascinating sweep. It reminded me a bit of reading or listening to Yuval Harari. And two things struck me. One is his insistence that everything is a story. So I was thinking, okay, how do you encapsulate what you told us in a story or in a set of stories? And actually what you were telling us, there were so many stories about the Kurdi picture and the girl in Malawi and other stories. So what you're telling us is interspersed with stories. But secondly, when I think it was in the 21st lessons for the 21st century, he was listing the various enormous changes, and one that it struck me you did not cover was artificial intelligence. And instead of focusing on humans, so much of that determines how we behave or makes decisions now is actually not controlled by humans. Well, the humans create the algorithms, but then in 30 or 40 years, maybe it would be irrelevant what the cognition, the history, the emotions of most of the humans, if not all of them, would be irrelevant. So my question is, how do you take account of that in your picture? Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah, good questions. In terms of the first part, the stories, I think part of the reason for the success of the effectiveness of the right wing and fossil fuel companies and others has been that what I call this Reagan meta story, that government is the problem and not the solution, and therefore the private sector is the solution. And I think progressives need to come up with perhaps one overarching or one or two general overarching stories that have that kind of breadth and depth and sweep that can counteract that. And maybe the COVID crisis is an opportunity to show that communities have reacted to fill the gaps. Government has done quite a lot, but communities have come in many cases around the world to respond. So it's not just the opposite of government was bad in the last 4 decades, now government is good. It's also involving communities, local organizations in this kind of alternative new meta story. But there's other, as you said, there's other smaller stories embedded within that can be used to relate to that one overall arching story, just as the right wing and the conservatives have come up with these other linked stories, such as the emphasis on freedom, for example. And I think one thing that has struck me is the right wing has co-opted this idea of freedom. And this relates to research on reciprocity, which is quite important. Freedom, as it's framed by the right, is a one-way street, that it's just me to do as I freely want, individual freedom. And Milton Friedman wrote with his wife, other half, Rose Friedman, a book called Free to Choose. That's completely wrong. We're not free to choose, we're influenced to choose. And two people who've attacked that book are Nobel laureates, George Akerlof and Robert Schiller. So if there's one pair of books that I might recommend reading, is called The Economics, it's called Fishing for Fools, spelled PH and PH, Fishing for Fools, The Economics of Manipulation and Deception. And they make the claim, which I think is fairly radical, that the economic system actually has inbuilt within it the tendency, it promotes manipulation and deception by corporations, and I think by big corporations. And I think if you look at many of the scandals and crises over the last 20 years, you can see underneath them there are examples of manipulation, deception, whether it's Enron or the finance companies or whatever crisis there is, there's a certain amount of manipulation and deception going on in the background. I don't think that's true for all businesses. I think many businesses, particularly local ones, they don't engage in that. They need the trust of their communities. But that book was one that I'd recommend reading. And Akerlof has gone on to write a book on identity economics, which I think is very relevant to current politics and economics. And the other part of that co-authorship, Robert Schiller has developed work on narrative economics. He says that stories are very important, and you can look at the financial crisis of 2008 in terms of the stories that were transmitted and floating around about what was going on then. So those, I think, relate to the idea of stories. Sorry, I lost you the second part of your question there, Borislav. That's one part.
About artificial intelligence.
Oh yeah, artificial intelligence.
Maybe the diminishing influence of humans on what happens with humans.
Yes, there's a that relates actually. That I've got a longer view of this version of this PowerPoint, which does cover what I call the 3A new technologies: artificial intelligence, algorithms, and automation. And they are either current or imminent threats under that bottom box on the right. And there's somebody who wrote a book on, I forget what it was called now. It was about the way maths, if I can get that reference later, but she was essentially saying that those writing algorithms and artificial intelligence aren't, they're biased themselves, they're largely white males, and secondly, they don't take into account the range of influences on people. So what is needed by those writing AI programs and algorithms and so on is for them to get out of their boxes and take perspectives of others, and for them to be educated not only in computers and programming and coding and so on, but to be also educated in emotions, social influences, cognitions, the limitations of human nature, as well as the strengths of human nature. I think that is beginning, but I don't think it's being done sufficiently. That's a partial answer. It's a big question, so thank you.
No, I welcome others to speak up. I noticed that we were doing a lot on Lakoff, and of course, you and I, Chris, have been talking about one of the books that you recommended, and then I read The Political Mind, and that has to do with how the right wing is much more effective than progressives are. You want to comment on that?
Yes, yeah, thank you. There's two books, yeah, there. Yes, one was the book by Drew Weston, W-E-S-T-E-N. He wrote a book after John Kerry's loss in 2004 called The Political Brain. And his claim, which I think, he's a neuroscientist actually, so what he did, he stuck people inside MRI machines and asked them different questions. And he found that the brains of people, sounds a bit far-fetched, but there is other research somewhat supporting this, that conservatives responded in rather different ways to progressives, particularly in the way things were framed. And conservatives responded much more in terms of their emotions, and the political right was very much more effective and has been much more effective over the past few decades in eliciting and exploiting emotions, mainly negative emotions, fear, loss, and so on, and other negative emotions. And you can see these playing out, I think, in recent elections in the US, the UK, and also in Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Brazil, the Philippines. These negative emotions have been exploited much more positive, much more effectively by those on the right. And another example of this, which is in terms of framing, which is George Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant. He's got a revised revision of that. And his examples there, he uses how the right has not only been effective in exploiting emotions, but also in framing things. And I think one of the turning points there came back in the late 1900s when they framed the inheritance tax as the death tax. And abortion has been, I think the right wing have been quite clever in the way they've framed the whole debate about abortion in going for emotions, and they've neglected to talk about the difficulties that women face in having many poor, lower income women, but all women of many ethnicities and income levels in unwanted births, which is obviously a major sensitive point. But I think the right have been much more effective in focusing on the unborn child than in the difficulties that women face in their lives. I mean, dealing with births and the whole process during and after. So that's one example. So death taxes, and there have been other examples that he quotes of how the right has been much more effective in framing things. And one final example relates to climate change, and this is an initiative developed by an outfit called CAST, which is, I think, the Centre for Research on Social Transformation, which is an initiative in the UK, primarily funded actually by the EU, believe it or not, to look at how we can bring about societal transformation at different levels. There's a group of researchers and NGOs at Bath University, Cardiff, Oxford, and others. And they looked at the narratives that were most effective with progressives and those which were most effective with conservatives. And they found actually that if climate change and environmental issues were framed in terms of conservation rather than in terms of justice, then that was a much more effective. So progressives, their conclusion was, shouldn't talk too much. I mean, within limits, it's correct and appropriate to talk about justice, but you should know your target and know your audience. Don't talk too much about justice with conservatives. Talk instead, and this is where it comes back to looking at things from their perspective, talk in terms about conservation, conserving resources, conserving your way of life, conserving your local environment, and that will be more appealing to them. So it's taking others' perspectives, framing things, and also taking into account different people's emotions.
Thanks, Chris. Vicky, you're on. You have a question or a comment?
Hi, yes, I do. Thank you. Christopher, thank you very much. Incredible amount of information there. And I only wish I had your memory, because the stuff that comes out is quite incredible. I have a startup in positive impact tourism, or what we might call tourism for sustainable development, which is global. And I work with tour operators and accommodations worldwide who very much are created from core for the purpose of creating good positive impacts locally in their destinations. I'm often asked, for want of a better word, which are my favorite SDGs, because I kind of work across all the SDGs, and favorite as opposed to, you know, what people should focus on, other people. And I often come down to two. One you mentioned, two, climate being one, because it's sort of overarching everything. And historically, I used to say poverty, but more recently, actually inequalities, which sits almost below everything. And what's been striking me recently is actually the root of both of these things, the problems we've got, is probably capitalism. And so if we look at, you know, me as a business, I'm a social enterprise. If we apply a kind of social enterprise mentality to politics, how do we change our future political systems or politics to mirror what is now happening in business and economic terms?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. I think that reminds me of another thing, another framing, and that is, I think progressives have been good in some ways, but they've also made some framing mistakes. And one framing error I've mentioned is that of course, it's right and necessary to talk about justice in the appropriate way, in the appropriate context, and context matters. But you should talk also about conservation, and that's one sort of trade-off, or one perhaps it's maybe a false dichotomy, maybe more of a continuum. The other one, which relates to what you were just saying, is equality. And I think what's interesting here is that there's some research that's been undertaken, which has found that people are much more concerned about unfairness than they are about inequality. And so if things are framed too much in terms of, oh, this is unequal and so on, talking only about inequality, people tend to respond to say, well, inequality is natural. People aren't born equal, and their circumstances aren't equal. And so sometimes for some people, inequality doesn't really resonate with them, whereas fairness does. And I think if you look at children and how what some of the things that children say are, oh, it's not fair, and they social comparison, they look at others. It's one of the most common complaints of children, I think, is it's not fair. And I think that emphasis on fairness is ingrained from a very early age. And I think actually there may even be some neuroscience research on, to support that. But I think framing things in terms of unfairness is going to have much more traction very often than framing in terms of inequality. So if you can talk about unfairness that has resulted from policies in the UK and the US and elsewhere over the past 20 years, who've been screwed and left out in various ways, it's very unfair. And emphasize unfairness in politics and environmental issues. It's unfair that poor people get the crap that the rich people produce. It's dumped on poor people in poor countries. And so there's unfairness, I think, ripples through all of many environmental issues, and perhaps not enough is made of that. that's one example. There are other things I could perhaps think of later, but off the top of my head, those are two things, and I'd be happy to talk more about that later.
It strikes me this is probably Trump's success then. Talk like a child, and this is what resonates.
Yes, indeed, yes. He's been very effective. He's been really clever in exploiting emotions and loss aversion in particular. The losses that white communities have felt fairly or unfairly in the Rust Belt states in America has perhaps been mirrored by the losses that people in communities in the North have felt in the UK. And that may help explain why Labour hasn't been sufficiently effective there. One other thing that this brings to mind is research on reciprocity. And this relates to pro-social behaviors. And reciprocity there's been a lot of research on reciprocity and how important that is and how it underpins pro-social behaviors and many types of human interaction. And there's both positive reciprocity through gift giving in cultures throughout time, and also revenge on its negative side. But people distinguish between, or researchers distinguish between several kinds of reciprocity. One is direct reciprocity. You help me and I help you, or you mess about with me and I'll mess about with you. The second is indirect reciprocity, and that is A helps B who helps C, and this is transmitted through social networks. And one of the other people I would suggest reading is somebody, well, there's two of them actually, called Nicholas Christakis and Fowler, I think it's Fowler, his co-author. And they've written a book on network connected, I think it's called, how networks are important and shape our lives. And that you've probably heard of 6 degrees of separation. They came out with the finding of 3 degrees of influence, how influences are transmitted, but only up to 3 degrees through social networks. So kindness and giving and generosity is transmitted through social networks, but only as far as the 3rd contact, and then it fades out after that. So indirect reciprocity works in communities and organizations when you don't necessarily get back from the person you've helped, but if that person in turn then pays it forward, then it promotes a sort of culture of giving and helping within an organization and a community. And the 3rd type of reciprocity is strong reciprocity, and this research has found that is important for cooperation. And if you want to promote cooperation in communities, in culture, you need strong reciprocity, and that involves punishing those who do wrong things, and just as much as helping those who do right. And I think here is another example of an imbalance. If you look back at most crises over the last 20 years, those who've committed these misdemeanors or crimes, in some cases corporate crimes, have not been sufficiently punished. Been a few exceptions, but hardly anybody has faced sanctions which are appropriate and for the crimes or the errors they've committed. And I think particularly with fossil fuel companies, they haven't been called out, and there are various ways of doing that through their shareholders. This is coming. This also relates to a comment I think you were making about business. You may be aware of the Business Roundtable in the States redefined the purpose of a company a couple of years ago. Milton Friedman's definition that the company just exists to make profits for its shareholders, that held sway for almost 4 decades. And then I think 2 years ago, the Business Roundtable of the States, of the US, came up with a different definition which incorporates that triple bottom line, and that's been done in the UK. But I think, again, that sounds nice, but it could be an example of either greenwash or nice wash, as some people call it. The PR material all sounds good, but if you look underneath the surface, there's a lot of stuff going on which contradicts what they're saying. So I think what people need to do is to probe and call out these companies and try and bring about strong reciprocity, try and bring about punishments, whether it's shaming and naming or punishments of various kinds. They don't have to be financial or jail terms, but the social punishments, there's a whole range of sanctions that can be called upon, I think, using all these influences. And I don't think progressives have sufficiently used that range of sanctions, as well as promoting the good things. And the other side of the coin is to promote more what good companies are doing and call that out as well. So it's both sides of the equation, I think.
Any other comments, or Vicky, when you actually posed the question about applying social enterprise to politics, did you have any particular ideas that you would suggest?
No, I wish I did. It's just a question in my mind. I mean, there's a huge growing market in social enterprise. I think probably particularly in the UK, actually. And it's just really intriguing where that's going to go, because to me that conflicts with the politics to some extent. On the other hand, it's still very much based on conscious consumerism. So maybe it doesn't actually.
Well, one book, I did mention this, the book that made quite an impression on me was a book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. This came out a few years ago. He's at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania in the States. It's actually a very readable book, Give and Take by Adam Grant. And I think I referred elliptically to his work before. He found by looking at many organizations, businesses, that those who prospered most were those who were actually most helpful. But it was nuanced, because those who spent all of their time helping others, he then described them as ending up as doormats, and they got knackered and wiped out and exhausted. They didn't get the balance right. So you need to get a balance right, and that's, I think, the idea of balances is appropriate in business, in life, in small scale, large scale, the balance between helping others and making time for yourself. But within companies, those who helped within limits in a balanced way were much more effective in themselves. And those businesses that promoted helping and giving and gave time to their staff to volunteer in communities, but volunteering in a real meaningful way, not just in a nice wash way, because a lot of this pro-social stuff that goes on in businesses, I think, is nice wash or greenwash. And if we can promote businesses to live up to this new code, of a triple or quintuple bottom line or whatever, and ask them, what are you actually doing to promote helping, giving, those 5 types of pro-social behavior: giving, helping, sharing, volunteering and cooperating. Ask them how much time you're giving off for your staff to volunteer. One business I looked at, they came out with this huge figure: our staff altogether have committed millions of hours in volunteering. When you actually drilled down, it was only about 1 hour a month per person. So it was fairly minimal, really, in reality.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our time together, so I would maybe in the chat box, or feel free, those who are still with us, to raise your hand and make any comments about what have been your takeaways. What is any aha moments in this talk today, and what is it that stands out and maybe compels us to action, that we maybe have a more informed action now? Because I see most people on the conversation this afternoon are in change and social change and on progressive side of things. So what is it that you've heard today that you feel like you could take away and use? And I don't want to put everybody on the spot, but I will circle back to Amanda, because I know she has some thoughts on this, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
The thing that I'm really reflecting on is the piece about understanding your enemies. What I've experienced personally is with the Boris Johnsons and the Trumps of this world, when they do things, they think, well, they've just broken the rules. So there's going to be consequences, because that's my view of the world. And what I'm having to learn is actually that's not everybody's view of the world. And that's, I think, is the deep thing that I'm beginning to realize, is I can't expect that everybody plays by the set of rules that I thought were universal, because they don't. And I think if anything that both Boris Johnson and Trump have displayed is actually you can disregard them completely and there are no consequences. And I think I've been brought up, and all of us have bought into the fact that there are consequences if you don't keep to the moral codes and the rules and play the game in the right way. And I think that's the most striking thing, is therefore we have to understand that there are a whole group of people for whom either there are a different set of rules, or their whole engagement in things is from a completely different perspective, and one we just haven't ever engaged in. And until we understand that, then you can't influence them, because you just don't know that they're operating in a different, literally a different paradigm to us. And that I think has been the thing that I've taken away. And the other thing was that I keep wondering whether we keep to our traditions of thinking we have to organize to do these things. And Tom, you know, I'm beginning to become a real convert about social movements, because I think it's tying into a completely different way of thinking about how to convene, which actually is much more organic, not organized and structured, whereas we've all become very structured. I mean, particularly in the development sector and humanitarian sector, it's all really, really well thought through and logical and rigorous, whereas social movements are very organic and things. And maybe there's a real power there that we've lost because we've tried to make things very organized, constrained, rigorous and logical. So
Yeah.
those are my takeaways.
No, beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. That just one comment on that. Yes, in terms of social movements, I think social networks are very important, and finding key people. There's a person who called Eva Schiffer who's developed a thing called NetMap, which is a participatory approach to looking at who in any community has I don't know whether any of you have come across that. It's who in any community has the most influence, and she does it's a way of mapping firstly who's connected with whom. That's the sort of the quantitative links, but then who within those networks has the most influence. And it's often not the obvious suspects, and it may well be older women who are not literate, but they get ignored by white males who are literate and well qualified who come in. And because older people or women or whoever they are, ethnic minorities, they don't talk in the right way or dress in the right way, they get overlooked. Within their communities and within their networks, they have influence. And I think this network influencing is very important. And if you can find the right group or the right person within a network, focus on them, you can spread influences quite rapidly through networks, which is a complementary approach to working in organizations. And just one other point about looking at perspective taking, it's partly looking at things from their mindsets, what mindsets do they have, but also what are their contexts? What context do they live in now? What are the contexts in which they've been brought up? What have been the defining things in their lives over the past few decades which have made an impression on them? And so contexts are just as important as mindsets and cognitions and emotions, the various contexts in which people now live and which they have lived and worked.
I think this is particularly important as we tend to demonize the other and to disrespect and to enter into a very visceral back and forth, as opposed to a deeper understanding of, like you're saying, context and what people's backgrounds are, and to a certain degree respecting that and working through that from a point of view of dialogue and not just this embattled back and forth. And I know, Jerry, this resonates with your research and your life experience over time in terms of seeing others and appreciating what exists in social organizations and both formal and non-formal.
I wasn't expecting to speak, sorry. You're absolutely right. I think reciprocity is fundamental. And the things that Chris was saying about the issue of unfairness, I think this is the thing we really have to hammer home. People get very upset when they see things are unfair. And because we're driven by reciprocity. You see this, who does the washing up? Who has to take the rubbish these are important things. And we underestimate how important it is that people should be seen to be pulling their own weight. And I think if we begin to see the world through the lens of reciprocity instead of sort of charity and philanthropy and all the rest of it, we actually begin to see a much more fundamental principle about what's keeping society together. And in Africa, there isn't, I think, a village that doesn't have rotating credit or burial associations, essentially really important pieces of glue that keep society together. And that's where the real philanthropy is, in my opinion. So I would very much urge, I completely agree with Vicky that the whole idea of reciprocity is hugely important, that unfairness is a much better way to touch people on inequality and on the imbalance in life.
That reminds me of a couple of other things. In terms of reciprocity, I think that there's a book also, Cialdini is one, the preeminent social influence researcher. He quoted, I think, Benjamin Franklin, who wanted to, was one of the early American founding fathers. There weren't many founding mothers, I think, in those days. The founders of the US, who said he wanted, there was somebody on the other side of, who was pissing him off for some reason, and he said, well, I'd like a book. Can you lend me one of your books? And so this person lends him a book, and by establishing that reciprocity there, it then developed a bond between them, and this was a sort of second way of reciprocity. It wasn't Benjamin Franklin giving the other person, it was giving the other person an opportunity to give to him. So if you can help them to help you, or help to help others, that can develop these bonds of reciprocity, which then transmit through social networks and communities. A second thing which has come out among many others from Cialdini, his books are worth looking at. One of them is called Yes! Exclamation mark. It's a very easy read. Is find commonalities. Whoever your enemies or your opponents are, there's something you have in common with them. So if you can look at their backgrounds, their interests, don't focus on the differences, try and find commonalities with them, and you will often, not always, but often find something you have in common. And what's particularly important is uncommon commonalities, he says. Try and find something which isn't just usual, but something unusual which you have in common. You can then talk about that, and that's a starting point. One final thing in terms of context, and you may know this term, the fundamental attribution error, which psychologists have researched. It's a tendency to attribute things to individuals rather than to context. So people blame poor people for the things that they do or don't do, and they blame politicians, but they don't look at the contexts which have led people, which have influenced poor people. They have no other choices but to do what they do. They ignore the context, they focus on the individuals, and I think this is particularly true of many conservatives, but it's also true of some progressives. They don't take sufficiently into account what are the contexts which have driven these people to make these choices and influence their behaviors and their mindsets.
And that's probably a good synthesis of our talk and kind of where we go next. And that is that having an empathy, deeper understanding, respect of others, and working on reciprocity. We are up to the last minute, so I think we're going to hear from Barry. Barry's going to put some music on for us to kind of reflect, and then we'll call it a day and see you next month.
Yeah, just a minute or so of something I want to share with you. But I want to go back to the point about numbers. And numbers are very important because I trained as a statistician, but sadly I learned that nobody is interested in my statistics because they are rational. And as Amanda said, they're controlling, they give us a rational basis. And actually what we need is to begin to think emotionally, because the other set of numbers is I'm involved in organizing, citizens organizing for power. And locally here in Tyne and Wear, we bring 1,000 people to a meeting with a politician, they listen. So numbers are really important and we need to organize. And there's one piece of organization that I want to pay homage to. And 10 years ago, I crossed a bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is in Selma, Alabama. And I walked across that bridge with a woman who had been on the 1965 April March. And she told me the story, and I felt moved beyond imagination. And I relived that dream. I relived that day in my mind, and in my left hand, I play the marching boots as they walked across that bridge with dignity. And the right hand of this piece is about that dignity and those dreams and those hopes and those fears as they faced the beating and the murders that followed that day, but it changed history. So this is Crossing the Bridge at Selma. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. See you next month.